violence is, and really just how terrifying and precarious it is, and that you can see how really desperate the Russian forces are at this point, because they are, very much behind their military goals, and they don't seem to A, have the resources, or B, really understand what to do once they occupy an area. So it's terribly traumatic for people. And mind you, when they do leave these places, when they are evacuated, they don't have anywhere to go. They may go to a quote unquote slightly safer place, but they don't know, they don't have a home to go to. There's no displacement camp for them. So it's just sort of one snowball after another. And it's just really hard to think this is happening in Europe in 2022.
What about where were you in Ukraine as all this is going on?
So for the kind of first part of the year before the full-scale invasion, I spent most of that in Donbass in the east, which was already at war. And
All right,
then,
let me stop right there,
yeah.
because we keep hearing you were in Donbass, and what we keep hearing from the other side is that Donbass has been under kind of continuing attack from Ukraine. Is that true?
Yes, so not all of it. So there are certain parts of it, Donetsk and another area that have been, they kind of occupied by pro-separatists. And then there are other cities just around that are still under fire, but they remain under Ukrainian occupation. So those sort of two main areas as what Russia is now trying to claim and wanting to essentially fold into Russian territory. And that may end up being a major negotiation point between Kiev and Moscow once they nut out sort of the terms to try to stop this war. So those areas are what they consider to be occupied by not Russians, but by pro-Russian separatists. But essentially they are supported by Moscow. And so then once the invasion sort of happened, and that was on February 24th, that began, I basically stayed sort of in that Kiev area and was sort of covering most of the city and then areas around that, which were under sort of heavy bombardment in Kiev Oblast. So I kind of stayed around the capital.
So you were there as the place is getting bombed.
Essentially, yes. I mean, the capital itself, I mean, there is a lot of artillery and certainly random bombings that happen, but the capital itself is, so far it's holding and isn't necessarily in a huge state of kinetic war. But around the city, 20 minutes outside of it, you have a lot of different smaller towns, villages, and cities that are under very, very heavy Russian shelling. And in some areas, Russian forces have occupied those areas. And that's sort of been, I think, a slow buildup of Russian troops that are trying to kind of get into the city. But once again, I don't think had anticipated the sort of resistance that they were going to get from the Ukrainians, and how effective a lot of the javelins and the stingers and the sort of the anti-tank missile systems that NATO countries have given Ukraine have really been in knocking out Russian air power. So it's certainly a tumultuous kind of situation there.
What I read today is that, according from the Russian side, that they have just eliminated the Ukrainian air and sea forces, that they don't exist anymore. I don't know if it's true or not.
It's always hard to say, and I find that I often have to kind of take a little bit, anything that both comes out of Kiev and Moscow, it's important to sort of take with a lot of skepticism, really, because both governments certainly have their own agenda and narrative and are putting forth how their version of events. So I think, you have to treat any of these official statements with a little bit of skepticism, because it's very hard to kind of verify anything that is being said, and you certainly have to take into account the very different agendas, and that both sides are painting very different pictures as to what is happening. And for me, it's certainly very clear that Russia isn't advancing anywhere near the degree to which they thought they would, but it is also very clear to me that has evolved into a tactic of really decimating areas and absolutely shelling very indiscriminately, and oftentimes it's civilians who are targeted in those attacks. So I think we're probably going to see a lot more attacks on civilians just because I think Russia is grasping at straws in trying to bring Ukraine to its knees.
Do you think the Ukrainian army will defeat the Russian army?
I know that that's sort of the popular narrative, and I think that every Ukrainian you meet is so willing to fight or play some sort of role in this war. I think there is absolutely no way that they're going to just kind of fall and accept whatever Moscow brings upon them. So in that case, even if they were to get in, you're looking at a very brutal and long guerrilla war that would go for a very long time. So I certainly don't see a Russian victory in any sort of way, shape, or form with their current military goals. But I'm also hesitant to kind of paint in big, glorious terms any kind of huge scale Ukrainian victory either, because I think we're only really hearing about the wins. And I think that Russia still has a very formidable presence, and they certainly have a lot of air power. So I think it's a little premature to sort of say that Ukraine is necessarily going to win or win anytime soon.
As I see it from my end, I don't know why there's not a ceasefire for peace. I'm totally opposed to Russia's invasion, just as I am totally opposed to America's invasions of all the countries